This is Richard RJ Eskow for the Zero Hour with an ad hoc conversation with Matt Taibbi. You know Matt from his books, from his writing for Rolling Stone, for his podcasts with Katie Halper, Useful Idiots, and so much more. So first, and I always appreciate our conversation. So first of all, Matt, thanks for coming on the program again.
No, thank you for having me.
Hopefully you'll do it again after this, because
Yeah, we'll see.
this may be the
It's
first conversation.
contentious. Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be. Well, my brother was saying maybe you should bill it as like kind of a WWF kind of, Rowdy Rick Eskow versus Stone Cold Matt Taibbi thing. But we'll see how it goes.
We'll see how it goes. I like that I get to be stone cold though. That's good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I expect since we're discussing a German philosopher of the mid 20th century, that before this is over, one of us will be hitting the other one with a chair, saying your epistemological interpretation of the Frankfurt School is absolutely wrong, because that's how this stuff goes.
That's right. Dialectical wrestling. I love it.
Dialectical wrestling. Yeah, the journey is the destination. But anyway, okay, so as I told you when I wrote you, I was looking forward to speaking to you about my disagreements with a piece you wrote recently about Herbert Marcuse,
Hmm.
the mid, I guess he's a Frankfurt School German philosopher, started out, had to leave Germany to flee Hitler, became a citizen of the United States, largely considered, or certainly considered by many, to be the intellectual father of the new left of the 1960s. Um, and trust me, when I was like a high school student radical in the late 1960s, everybody knew who he was. The
Hmm.
ratio of people who had his book to his most famous book, One Dimensional Man, to actually read it was, strongly, not correlated. I mean, I would say
Right.
one person in 10 could make their way through it. But there was a lot of brilliant, provocative stuff there. You wrote an essay. Well, let's start with this. As I understand, my sense is you asked your readers
Hmm.
who you should write about, and they proposed Marcuse.
Yeah, we have kind of a running thing on my site where I ask them uh, which books I should review, and if so, like for instance, they asked me to review an old Christopher Lash book a month ago, and this time around, the initial choice was people wanted me to review the Ibram Kendi book,
Uh-huh.
but then somebody suggested that it would be better to review Marcuse because it encompasses a lot of thinkers like that who are now suddenly coming into vogue. I had never read him before. I'd read about him, so I thought, why not? And this was the result. So I should admit entirely at the beginning that I'm not. I didn't study philosophy in college, and I have not read all the accompanying texts of his, and or many of his contemporaries or any of those things. I'm looking strictly at just two books, and actually a book and an essay collection, and that's really it.
And that gets to actually one of the reasons why I asked Matt
Hmm.
is I feel like I know you a little bit by now, and I almost feel like you went into this exercise with some preconceptions about him. And
Hmm.
I don't universally embrace everything he said or did or thought. The essay I think you primarily focus on, which is repressive tolerance, I have problems, major problems with, but I sort of think that this was you were a little bit of a hanging judge to
Mm.
Marcuse. That and let me kind of back that up a couple ways. One is you kind of trash intellectuals as a class going in
Hmm.
with an anecdote, right? Which
Right.
right away, I'm not an intellectual. My ADD got in the way of that kind of
No,
act.
we're all intellectuals a little bit, I
What?
think we're all intellectuals.
Sure.
I
I mean,
think.
we all
Yeah.
think about ideas, right? We all
Yeah.
debate ideas, but you tell an anecdote, the punchline is they're intellectuals, they can justify anything, which is already kind of like stacking the deck of, you know, now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defendant may be, an honorable stockbroker, but I'll tell you, you know what I mean? I like intellectuals, first of all. I think they perform a useful public service. And,
Well,
and that,
if I could push back,
okay, sure.
I agree with you. Intellectuals, like anything else, can be a force for good or not, um, but they have a peculiar quality of being like the only sort of people who can um, who can kind of revel in nonsense at length. you know,
Oh, I don't think they're
uh,
the only kind. I think they are a kind, but
yeah.
I would not give them the distinction of being the only people who can do that. But I hear you. I get what you're saying.
Mm.
From there, you pivot to QAnon, and your piece is called Marcuse and Non. Um, Here, and this gets to one of my several points of disagreement with you. Basically, I think your QAnon analogy, and I think a lot of the rest of your piece bears this out, is that you really consider what you consider to be today's left, the sort of elite intersection of Nancy Pelosi and Kente Cloth with Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase taking the knee, along with a kind of cloud of people that surrounds him, Hannah Jones from the New York Times, or whomever, as being the intellectual godchildren of Herbert Marcuse. And I don't know where you got that idea, but I don't think it's true. So maybe I'm missing something. Where'd you get the idea?
Well, first of all, I brought up QAnon because part of the reason I think that story is such a huge story and such a huge fixation for people in the current sort of mainstream media is that uh, they're projecting an idea to their audience that we're the smart ones, right? Like, look at how stupid these people are, and look, it is stupid. There's no question about it. But ultimately, the reason that those stories have such traction and such purchase with modern kind of MSNBC audiences is because it's reinforcing this idea that there's this other group of people who just simply uh, aren't qualified to make democratic decisions, and we are those people. And I think that's an idea that you find throughout, for instance, repressive tolerance, and also, to in One Dimensional Man. He's talking about how the conditions for true freedom don't really exist among most people. I read an interview where somebody was challenging him on this, and he was saying, well, these people don't really have the ability to make decisions, responsible political decisions, and he compared them to the Germans of the early Nazi period. They're so completely dominated by a contemporary propaganda and by their material comforts and by pop culture and that they just simply lack real consciousness or real autonomy. And the implication of that, of course, is that conversely, I do have that
Right.
consciousness and autonomy, and that I think led directly to what repressive tolerance is all about, which is, in order to have progress, we can't just simply allow the unfettered exchange of ideas. We have to take away the ability, the right of some to to spout their ideas and to have civil liberties and to enhance the stature of others. And I think that's implicit in a lot of what's going on today, especially with these arguments for censorship uh, you know, and
So
other tightenings of civil liberties.
I hear you, although I would argue that the repression and calls for censorship we're seeing today are not descended from or inspired by Marcuse, but we'll get to that. I mean, first of all, you said, and I can't argue with you that there's an element of we know and you don't. in Marcuse's position, especially in repressive tolerance. To a greater or lesser extent, there too, I think we all, when only a handful of us were writing that the Obama administration was going down the wrong track, then among the left in general, we genuinely believed, and I think we were right. We knew and they didn't. And right, I mean, everybody do. That's not unique to Marcuse or John Stuart Mill or anybody. It's
Yes and
right.
no.
What am I
I
missing?
mean, so I think that the difference is, I think if you had asked the majority of people who were self-described liberals 20 years ago, do you think you're right about politics today? Yes. Do you think that you have an absolute monopoly on the truth and that only you should be allowed to exercise political rights? No, of course not. Right? I mean, I think the entire
Right, that's fair.
concept
Yeah.
of the American system, especially, is based upon this idea that nobody can ever fully be absolutely sure of what the truth is, and that we collectively arrive at the truth by allowing this free exchange of ideas, and eventually a kind of consensus or truth emerges. But the only way it can emerge is by allowing everybody to speak, and so there's a difference between having confidence in one's beliefs and believing that you might know better, and that certainly has always been a feature of people, on the political left and liberals, and I was one of those people. I grew up in that world, but the difference is this new idea that that's so true that we need to take away not only the sort of the rights of other people, but the ability of their ideas to be seen and heard, and that's new.
Right. And I would say, again, first of all, I don't agree with Marcuse about that element of what he wrote. But in fairness to him, number one, I wouldn't just dismiss him as a quack. I think he had a lot of brilliant and interesting ideas and really changed a lot of people's way of looking at the world in a very constructive way. I think on this so I don't think it's fair to dismiss him as a quack. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, as far as the idea of repressive tolerance, I don't like it either. Let me just be upfront about that. I don't think it's right. But his analysis was not only, in my view, new and important and accurate, that we were having a sort of kayfabe uh, version of democratic open debate based on a deceptive view of the world, and that views that challenge that were never entered into the debate. So he was kind of basically saying you have to give some sort of special way to force those views into the debate. And the only way he could imagine, I think he was wrong, was by limiting the prevailing viewpoint. But I think both you and I at various times have, at one point he even uses the word bipartisan. And I think at one point, certainly today, both you and I agree that the bipartisan debates that occur, for example, in mainstream media or the political world, are very prescribed in what they have to say. So I think in the 60s, when he first pointed that out, it was not only, important to point out, but however wrong his prescription, his diagnosis, even today, still has some weight.
I hear that, and a lot of people pointed out that he, in One Dimensional Man, he's saying a lot of the same things that for instance, I've written about, and criticism of media, that there's, especially in things like the way we cover presidential elections, there's a uh, there's a phoniness to it. There's an implication of democratic choice that people believe is far more expansive than it is in reality. In reality, the choices are extremely limited, and you're really not given a whole lot of choice. And of the choices you get, you're very unlikely to see real progress made in issues of real importance. However, there's a huge difference between that and saying freedom doesn't exist at all. We live under totalitarianism. He uses that word. The
Right.
democratic totalitarianism. The conditions do not exist for autonomy, and look, he's being hyperbolic, I think. But
Right.
the problem is that that hyperbole has been interpreted by a whole generation of subsequent thinkers, and it's just simply not true. I mean, to not recognize, as I was reading him, I was thinking about people like, you know, Mikhail Bulgakov, right? Who's in 1937, he's sitting in his apartment and he's writing Master and Margarita, and there are murders raging all around him, and he's waiting for the knock on the door that could happen
Right.
at any moment. That's that's actual totalitarianism, where there is such a total absence of freedom that it's literally an emergency. Uh, and I think Marcuse downplays the value of just being able to say and think what you want, without legal recourse. I mean, he writes a book. He made a fortune writing a book that basically called for the overthrow of the state. And how totalitarian can that system be? And
Well, okay. There's a counter argument to that, Matt Taibbi, which is it's smart enough to absorb a Marcuse so that he's not a threat. That Marcuse's name calling, that this system is totalitarian, becomes another form of entertainment. You can buy, it's 1967, you can buy the latest Frank Zappa album and rebel that way, or you can buy One Dimensional Man. Either way, the system has absorbed its dissidents into its self-preservation, which, by the way, I would argue has happened. Now, I partially agree with you. Okay, I partially agree with you, although I do find it interesting that Marcuse, who is a fugitive from fascism, felt that way at the time. And I think part of his urgency was probably, nuclear war and all that, which really people felt could happen at any time. But he drew that conclusion, which I find intriguing. I don't draw that conclusion, but I think where I struggle is in his application of it, which was anti-colonialist, anti-capitalist, anti-war, to the modern day uh, forms of censorship and censoriousness that you link him to, which I don't see a through line there at all. I mean, maybe Robin DiAngelo cites cites him somewhere. Maybe Ibram X, Fendi
Fendi.
does. I don't know because I've read White Fragility, but I offloaded most of it from active memory, and so I guess what I would say is a lot of people have suggested censoring other people, not just Marcuse. And I think that if he were alive today, my guess is he would reject Robin DiAngelo. He would reject the idea of censoring on behalf of Nancy Pelosi or Jamie Dimon, two people you mentioned on social media. I mean, this was not a guy, you said at one point leftists are capitalists on Twitter. Uh, well, he was not, say what you want about him. He wasn't a capitalist.
Sure, but the yes, but his ideas have been appropriated. I think, ironically, the way that capitalism absorbed Marcuse was to take all of the ideas that serve its purposes, that are anti-democratic, that are um, that are derogatory in their descriptions of the working class, and and argue in favor of censorship and the deprivation of rights. All of those ideas have somehow survived. What's gone is the idea that this has to be tied to a complete overthrow of capitalism, and so we've got this sort of bastardized version, excerpted version of repressive tolerance, whose idea and those ideas are everywhere these days. This notion that sort of liberal democracy has failed us. If we allow unfettered free speech, what we get is Trump. Therefore, we have to start thinking about new solutions to things. We need to censor. Due process is no longer all that important. It's a trick of the oppressor to worry endlessly about rights when what we should be worrying about is outcomes. These are things you hear all day long on social media.
They
And
are.
yeah.
And you and I have talked before, I probably feel as strongly, well, maybe not as strongly as you, because you're super dry, but very close to as strongly as you do about these things. I really abhor that tendency.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's antithetical to a lot of values I hold and a lot of values that I always associate with the left or
Hmm.
used to. But having said that, I still don't get where you blame Marcuse for that. I mean, there are a lot of people out there say, attacking the notion of free speech. He explicitly did it in the name of greater democracy, not, restoring individual wounds to, certain populations, whatever.
Well, yeah, but I would argue that that's just semantics on his
Okay.
part. Yeah, because what he says is, yes, he wants to establish the pacification of existence, and in order to get there, however, we need to deny rights to certain people. There's just no other way to do that, to reach that stage. I mean, this is a passage that I thought was amazing. Um, you know, the formula would include the withdrawal of toleration of speech and assembly from groups and movements which promote aggressive policies, armament, chauvinism, discrimination on the grounds of race and religion, or which oppose the extension of public services, social security, Medicare, medical care, etc. Moreover, the restoration of freedom of thought may necessitate new and rigid restrictions on teachings and practices in the educational institutions which, by their very methods and concepts, serve to enclose the mind within the established universe of discourse and behavior. So he's saying that in order to get to this paradise of democratic freedom, we have to deny rights to a whole range of people, and he lists some of the things, some of the reasons that they may be denied their rights. And then he says, once we get there, we're going to have to impose new and rigid restrictions, on education, and that's only a beginning of the things that he talks about. And
And
this
again, that's some of the stuff I don't agree with, but you also surely you recognize that that's a de facto state of affairs anyway, and that I think we should all be fighting, which is I think you can't teach certain things if you're an elementary school teacher. There are certain, and you start to talk about too much about bank exploitation and rip-offs or whatever, you're going to get called before your principal. If so in other words, he had, again, I'll say, the wrong solution, which is he saw the suppression of certain ideas and forms of speech that were, in his view, and largely in my liberatory. Uh, he thought the solution was counter suppression. I don't. But again, prescription wrong, diagnosis not completely wrong at all. But I still don't get, Matt, and I'm going to keep coming back to it. Why do you think, and maybe, again, maybe there's a whole chain of publications that I've missed. It's certainly possible. Why is it Marcuse's fault? I mean, there are a lot of people out there. You think the people who are, got James Bennett fired for running Tom Cotton's thing. Maybe they all know Marcuse. I don't know. I think it was.
No, I think they were raised in an academic environment where this kind of thinking is now kind of hegemonic. It's uh, a lot of these ideas are ideas that you'll find in, whether it's from Angela Davis to Kimberly Crenshaw, and and the all the people who are cited by the likes of Robin DiAngelo and Kendi and all that. Look, there's another aspect to this, which is his political formula for his conception of what the revolution is going to look like. He goes to great lengths in One Dimensional Man to talk about how the proletariat he's completely given up hope on them because they lack the consciousness to
Right.
autonomously make decisions on their own behalf. And so he talks about a new coalition, which seems to me just completely opportunistic and um, and coincidental. It doesn't show up in any of his prior writings. Like we're going to look at the unemployed and the unemployable, the persecuted colored races. That's the phrase that he uses. I think he mentions the disabled in another forum. So now that's where we're going to get the revolutionary energy, and this is kind of the basis of a lot of the sort of intersectional thought. Now it's we're no longer going to look to the working class or the proletariat to be the basis of revolution. We're going to formulate an ideology that's based around oppressed peoples or oppression, and within that framework, that part of it I have less of a problem with. It's the fact that within that framework, the solution they propose to establishing political power when they probably won't have a democratic majority to achieve it is the use of illiberal political ends. Again, suppression of civil rights, minority rule, elite rule. I mean, that's really the prescription.
Again, I disagree with the prescription that he gave. And I will say this. I think a development, and this will be controversial of me to say it, but I'm going to say it anyway, not to you necessarily, but I think what Marcuse did not anticipate was that this system, for a lack of a phrase, and it's a corny phrase because it implies more coherence and conspiracy than really having the kind of a bunch of stuff that perpetuates itself is a better term to me. But what he didn't anticipate, in my view, is the extent to which in the last 50 years or so, instead of continuing to suppress certain groups, powerful forces in this country have shrewdly chosen to elevate individuals from among those groups and make them the enforcers, so that if anyone dares challenge what they're saying on behalf of the powers that exist and silencing dissenting voices, it's portrayed as some form of bigotry rather than a political disagreement between two viewpoints. I think that is, and since I worked for Bernie in 2016, I saw it up close and personal.
Mm-hmm.
We heard a lot of talk about breaking the glass ceiling, which is a great thing to do. We heard no talk about what was going to be best for everybody in the basement who was, so I think that's the piece that Marcuse, when he talked about various individual groups, didn't see coming. But I also
he also didn't. I mean, he based a lot of one-dimensional man on the idea that material needs were being met, and that was no longer a factor for
right.
For people. And he talked with distress about going to an auto factory and asking people what they thought. And this isn't in the book. This was in an interview. But and they responded that they were upset about all sorts of things, but when he asked them about revolution, they weren't interested because they saw their situation as being not perfect, but rife with problems that could be fixed, and that to him was an indication that they lacked a revolutionary sensibility. Anyway, he was incorrect in the notion that everybody's material needs were going to be met. What's happened since then is that we've had a total collapse of the system on that front. Not total, but a significant one. And so his whole notion of sort of working people as needing to be excluded from the formula for political success, again, I think that runs counter to the Sanders theory of
right. And I agree with you. By the way, I think that's his worst moment, because even then, things have gotten worse for many people in the working class since then. But even then, it wasn't true that everybody had their needs. By a long shot, there were, tens of millions, but poverty was a major problem. So that may be the most insulated and privileged thing, mistake Marcuse ever made.
Including among the quote persecuted colored races that he mentions. Yeah.
But to be fair, fair isn't the right word, but you called it an afterthought that he included the persecuted colored races, but elsewhere you say it's sort of integral to his thoughts. So I would argue, okay,
Right.
but yes, no, I hear what you're saying, but then here's something else, Matt Taibbi, from your piece, and I'll admit I laughed out loud when I read it, and then I thought, wait a minute, okay,
Okay.
and that was, you probably know, you wrote about him to say this is a warped concept of danger, meaning the extreme danger of the present state of society in his time is an epic understatement. Then you write with in italics 911, what is your emergency? Hi, I live in a society where citizens choose to struggle in the market rather than enter a workless Eden of pure freedom in which man's okay. So first I laughed, and I thought, wait a minute, was there ever a vote where I get to say whether or not I want to toil in the marketplace or live in a workless Eden run by Herbert Marcuse? Because if there was a referendum, I missed it. And in other words, I guess you're kind of, you're reductio ex ad absurdum there, which is the only thing I remember from philosophy class. That, yeah, I mean, I actually happen to think it's true that if most people understood a different kind of life was possible, they'd probably pick it.
Yes, okay, but my point is he's saying in the context of, well, yes, we would only justify the absolute cessation of speech rights, rights to assembly, all these other things in the context of an extreme emergency, like absolute danger, right? And
Right.
I don't think, again, this gets back to the conversations he was having with those auto workers. Their situation might have sucked, but emergency is a word that we use for a reason. It's supposed to be confined to certain kinds of situations. I don't think that was an emergency. I don't think this. I mean, I think you could argue the condition of black citizens in the Jim Crow era, that was an emergency. That was a time when measures like that when it might have been called for. But suspending all civil liberties at a time when progress can be achieved by strikes. I mean, think of all the things that workers did achieve during that one century. They got the 40-hour work week, they got benefits, they got all sorts of things, and they did it without having to put an unelected junta of intellectuals in charge of suspending civil rights. I think that's what I'm objecting to. There is this, you can't use words like totalitarian and emergency, you know, and have them just not mean anything.
Well, yeah, I don't know if he would say they didn't mean anything. They don't mean what you and I would say, believe they mean. They meant something different to him. And, kind of totalitarianism of the spirit, they were very into the psychological stuff, which I don't totally dismiss either, to be honest. But, two more points, or topics, and then I'll let you go. But one is the left. Okay. You and I have had different definitions of the left in the past, and yours is not less valid than mine. But mine is more old school, right? It's the left is socialism, it's economic redistribution as well as racial and social justice of all kinds. And yours tends to be, and I remember Nathan J. Robinson went after you in an essay. And what I thought Nathan did that was wrong is what he said, Taibbi gets the left wrong, which I guess I would sort of agree with, but then he debated you based on his definition of the left, not your definition. So,
Right.
But I would argue that when Marcuse talks about the left and elevating the voices of the left, he's not talking about corporate vice presidents who are being pushed forward as examples of diversity in a system that is still biased in all its other hiring and its employment practices and its lending practices or whatever. He means something different than that. So I think there's a little bit, again, I'm not saying your definition is wrong, but I think it's different than Marcuse's. And I think to hold one to the other is maybe a mistake.
Well, okay. So by one definition, you could even say that Marcuse maybe isn't even left because he's such a departure from Marx's traditional conception of what leftism is. He's completely cast himself off from the idea um, of Marxism as a movement of proletarian revolution. The
Right.
proletariat are no longer important in his formulation. So maybe that's not the left. I don't know. But I'm certainly not saying that Jamie Dimon and Nancy Pelosi are left. I'm saying that the the sort of self-styled new left, people who call themselves left, that these figures, at these companies are now draping themselves in ideas in the kind of in a sort of a patina of leftism, uh, that in this prescription, this idea of leftism that you might get from reading Repressive Tolerance, which is that um, it's a system where we have a super empowered group of elites who, on behalf of oppressed groups, is going to have to do the hard work of suspending civil liberties for everybody else, and sort of imposing progress from above. And that's why, and so people like Jamie Dimon and Nancy Pelosi, they're they're draping themselves in this signaling that they're on board with this movement, when of course they're completely opposite to that. And that might not be Marcuse's fault if he didn't anticipate that his ideas would be bastardized in this fashion. But um, but the text, unfortunately, in my eyes, I think it allowed for um, for that kind of confusion to happen. I mean, you're not going to get Thomas Paine or Thomas Jefferson or John Stuart Mill. They're not going to end up being twisted around to become an argument for the secession of civil liberties. But Marcuse opened the door for that to happen, and opened the door for people like everybody from Jamie Dimon to Nancy Pelosi to all these other figures in the Democratic Party, to figures in the intelligence community, to argue that they're on the side of progress, because they're going through the sort of prescribed pieties of a version of leftism that's described in his work.
Yeah, although again, I wouldn't say that Marcuse ever told somebody that the way to achieve justice was to wear a kente cloth while you were going about, the business of an oligarchical government,
No,
or as a white person, or to run a bank, but to performatively take the knee, even as you're still covertly redlining. I don't think that even, I mean, I get your point. I will accept your point that indirectly certain examples of silencing, probably through certain Kendi and maybe a couple others, have been warped or whatever they were bastardized to use for this purpose. But I don't think anywhere in Marcuse's thinking, maybe I missed it, but did he encourage this kind of faux performative progressivism? Did he?
no, probably not. It's an open question to me whether he would have been horrified or not by the direction all this took. Maybe he would have been, which would have been to his credit. Um, but I don't know. I mean, I again, the core thing to me is this idea that liberalism has run its course, and we now need to adopt illiberalism, uh, as practiced by a kind of minority of people who know better, and the justification for their enhanced power is their overweening concern for the oppressed peoples. Um, So again, that entire formula is in repressive tolerance.
Well, I'll give you a little bit of acknowledgement on that one. But I will not yield. He was not, I don't think it's fair to call him a crank, number one. And number two, before we go, I'm going to hit you with my toughest criticism yet,
Sure.
which is one of the ways, especially at the end, that you go after Marcuse is by suggesting he wasn't American enough.
Well, he wasn't.
Well, wait a minute. He was a citizen of the United States. Who's more American than who? What makes him any less American than any other American citizen? You,
Well,
because he probably never touched a Harley, a blues guitar, a Budweiser, or a baseball without a hazmat suit. I mean, come on, man. You could
no,
be
no,
a
no. What I'm saying there is that he probably somebody who disliked this country as much as he did would the irony that he's now going to become the standard bearer for modern America. I would kind of hope that it would horrify him. That was what I was trying to say in that passage.
Yeah,
But
you did say that, but how do you know? But you also said elsewhere nothing about Marcuse was American except his most important quality, he was a quack. Nothing about him was immigrant intellectuals are Americans too. You know that.
well, here's the
He's a
thing.
different kind of American, okay? I mean, he doesn't pop a plap. He didn't pop a Pabst Blue Ribbon.
Yeah, but that's not
And
what that's not the important thing that about his non-Americanness to me. The thing that's important is his total disregard for the things that we most cherish in this country, which are individual rights and freedoms. He came here as a refugee from an actually totalitarian society, uh, made a very comfortable living, enjoyed absolute freedom to do whatever he wanted to do, spread his ideas as far as he could, and turned around and essentially argued that this country needed to be overthrown. But not only that, that the biggest problem with this country was its excessive belief in individual rights and liberties, and that concept needed to be sidelined in order for actual progress to take place. And I'm sorry, these are the things that distinguish. It's the central idea of being an American is the belief that everybody is supposed to have all these freedoms. The government is not. Nobody's supposed to be able to take our rights away. It's the first regulatory mechanism against the imposition of despotism is we preserve individual rights because people will fight for them, right? We have a system of checks and balances that's designed to disperse power as much as possible. It's of course imperfect. It doesn't do a great job of that, but the whole concept of the United States is to prevent something like Nazi Germany from happening, right? And the first thing that we emphasize, and the thing that I think the framers were primarily concerned with, was having observed despotic, autocratic societies throughout Europe, and was was this notion of protecting, recognizing that people had inherent inalienable rights that couldn't be taken away under any circumstances, and that if you believed in that, if people believed in that, that they would fight for those rights. And we managed more or less successfully for hundreds of years to preserve at least that little baseline, which distinguished us from lots of other societies. And so, I yeah, I just don't think I think he what bleeds through in his work is, and again, I mentioned that there are other immigrant authors who come here and they nail America and all of its stupidities and shallowness. I mean, I think about a book like Lolita, where a character who's probably a little bit like Marcuse, in terms of his attitude towards what he's seeing, he just destroys the United States in his description of it. But you know, it's one thing to look at this country as stupid and shallow and commercialistic and uh, and militaristic and all those things, but he targeted the one thing about us that is actually, I think, important and unique, and I'm sorry that offended me.
Well, yeah, but that's I get that, but that's A, that's not the sum total of his work. B, as one essay. B, I don't think he's a quack. He proposed something I object to. And C, I don't think his immigrantness had anything to do with it. I think and I guess I would, just end by saying, if somebody like that sees what happened in Nazi Germany, comes here, looks around in the 1960s and says we're in trouble, I may not like his solution, but my main intellectual, if I dare use that word, response is, I wonder what makes him say that. Not F this guy, he just got here, he doesn't have a right to start knocking our most fundamental liberty. I mean, I get that response, but it's not mine.
I yeah, I respect that, and I do. I understand that a person who's been through the experience that he's been through, uh, look, he was responding to the ineffectual nature of the Weimar government that was too permissive and allowed this anti-democratic movement to thrive. It voted itself in. There was a democratically elected government that practiced all these monstrosities. And up until he says up until the time the war started, the majority of the country was probably in favor of it, which makes him suspicious of democratic majorities, and I get that. But I think again the the flaw in the reasoning is that the solution to this is to just jump straight to another form of autocracy.
No,
You know,
I agree with you there. So I think we'll
right,
just
right.
have to, acknowledge our point of agreement, which is we should not be an autocracy. Not a shocking conclusion for either one of us to come to. I guess disagree on the overall worth of Marcuse as a thinker. And again, not that I'm a scholar of him, but I found a lot of
No, this
value
is
in him.
it's fun to
And
talk about. I mean, I appreciate you're doing it. I really do. Look, I'm not a scholar either, so I'm just
yeah, and
reacting to.
I mean, I don't want to just say, I don't, I wanted to talk it through with you. That's all. So I'm glad we did it. And
Excellent,
by the
excellent.
way, I like Harleys and I'm not a bad blues man either. So oh, you can't see the guitars anymore, but I just protect other Americans' rights not to. That's all. So fair enough, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, I just think that he didn't place enough value on things that were maybe they fell short of giant leaps forward, but they were valuable in themselves. I mean, he lived during a time of an extraordinary flowering of art, music, journalism, maybe not architecture, but some other things, and it was just it was so abjectly pessimistic, this work, that's what I was responding to.
Fair enough. All right. Well, Matt Taibbi, as always, great talking to you. As always, great reading you, even when we disagree on some things. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Oh, thank you, Richard.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and you are listening to The Zero Hour.